The restaurant hummed with a vibrant energy that only a place like this could contain, as laughter bubbled up from the tables, glasses clinked in rhythmic harmony, and a soft undercurrent of music played in the background, creating the perfect atmosphere for celebration. Golden fairy lights stretched across the ceiling, their warm glow reflecting off the polished wood of the long dining table, where my colleagues and I sat, laughing, chatting, and basking in the light of our collective success. Tonight was supposed to be special. It had been 5 years in the making, and I had poured my heart and soul into this company, often staying late to fix problems no one else wanted to handle, mentoring employees who needed guidance, and stepping in to do whatever it took to help the company grow. It wasn't always in my job description, but it didn't matter. I did it because I loved what I did, and I believed in the company's vision. For months, Richard, my boss, had been subtly hinting that I was next in line for the senior manager position. He'd said it with a smile, wrapped in praise and casual compliments, but tonight was supposed to be the night that everything I'd worked for would finally come to fruition. The promotion I had earned was going to be announced, and I could already picture the moment in my mind, the applause, the recognition, the validation of all the sacrifices I'd made over the years. I adjusted the hem of my navy blue dress nervously, trying to keep my composure as I glanced around the table at my team, who were, thankfully, still in high spirits. We had just wrapped up a successful quarter and everyone was celebrating, but my eyes kept flicking to the head of the table, where Richard stood, a glass of wine in hand, raising it with the soft clink of a fork against the glass. The room fell into an expectant hush, and my heart began to beat louder in my chest, every thud echoing in my ears. "Tonight," Richard's deep voice broke the quiet, strong, and clear, "I want to take a moment to recognize someone who has shown incredible dedication, drive, and talent in just a short time here at the company. It's rare to find someone who can make such an impact in only 3 months." My stomach dropped. 3 months? That couldn't be right. Richard's gaze shifted toward Lisa, the bright new hire who had been with the company for all of 3 months. I stared, stunned, as Richard's words continued, though they felt like they were being spoken underwater, far away and distorted. "Lisa," Richard said, his smile wide and genuine, "you've exceeded all our expectations. Your leadership, creativity, and problem-solving skills have impressed us all, which is why I'm thrilled to announce your promotion to senior manager. Congratulations." The room erupted into applause, and my hands froze mid-clap. My fingers tightened around the stem of my champagne glass as I felt my throat constrict, my face pulling into a smile that was more painful than genuine. I clapped along with everyone else, but inside, I could feel everything slipping away. Lisa, of course, was gracious, standing up and blushing under the spotlight as she accepted the promotion. But all I could focus on was the harsh sting in my chest, the cold, crushing reality of what had just happened. This wasn't supposed to be her night. It was supposed to be mine. After 5 years of pouring my heart into the company, of constantly stepping up without question, I was being overlooked for someone who had barely begun to scratch the surface. As Lisa took her place at the head of the table, I forced my gaze to shift back to Richard, who, as if on cue, turned toward me with a grin and a laugh. "And of course," he said, his voice almost patronizing in its warmth, "Kathy, you've been such a valuable member of the team. We really appreciate everything you do." The words felt hollow, meaningless, and my heart twisted in a way I couldn't put into words. 5 years. 5 years of being there for the company, and this was all I got? A casual, empty acknowledgement? I swallowed hard and smiled, the pressure in my chest threatening to suffocate me. "Of course, Lisa absolutely deserves it," I said, my voice coming out more strained than I intended as I lifted my glass for a toast. "She's really proven herself in ways I couldn't." Richard nodded, and then, in that moment, he dropped the bomb I hadn't expected but should have. "She does a lot more than you already, Kathy. You should take notes." Laughter followed, Lisa giggling awkwardly, muttering something about not being that great, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, and despite the laughter around me, I couldn't help but feel like the punchline to a cruel joke. I laughed along with them, but it was hollow, empty, a mask over the growing frustration and humiliation bubbling inside me. What else was I supposed to do? Cry? Beg him to explain why he'd strung me along for months, only to humiliate me in front of everyone? Number. Instead, I took a slow sip from my glass, letting the alcohol burn as I tried to push everything down, as if drowning the ache in my chest could somehow make it go away. The night dragged on after that, full of empty pleasantries, forced conversations, and smiles that felt like shards of glass against my teeth. I celebrated, I chatted, I pretended. But inside, a storm was brewing, and I knew something had shifted. By the time the party ended and I stepped out into the cool night air, my mind was made up. I couldn't stay in this place anymore. I had been loyal to a company that had no respect for me, a company that had taken me for granted for far too long. I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed out a short, simple email to HR, my resignation letter. I read it over once, then twice before hitting send. The subject read, "Resignation Letter, Submission, the body. Dear Richard, please find my official resignation letter attached. Effective immediately. Best, Kathy." I hesitated for only a moment, the weight of the decision settling on my shoulders, before hitting send. The moment the email left my outbox, I felt something inside me shift. Relief. I wasn't stuck anymore. I wasn't chained to a place that had no place for me. It was a small victory, but it was mine. And then, as if on cue, Monday came. The office was different that morning when I walked in, stepping through the familiar doors with a quiet satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. Richard had no idea what was coming. He didn't know that by the time I walked in, my resignation letter was already sitting in his inbox, and he was about to get a very rude awakening. The receptionist greeted me with her usual bright smile, and my coworkers gathered around the break room, chatting casually over their coffee, acting as though nothing had changed. Lisa was at her desk, enjoying the afterglow of her promotion, looking proud, her smile wide. I didn't blame her. She hadn't done anything wrong. But the real issue was Richard, the man who had played me for a fool for so long, pretending I was valued, only to discard me when it suited him. I took my time settling in, calmly placing my bag next to my desk and booting up my computer. I wanted Richard to come to me, and sure enough, right on cue, his office door swung open, and I heard the words I'd been waiting for. "Kathy, my office." Now. The whole floor fell silent, and my coworkers exchanged nervous glances, the tension palpable in the air. Richard's tone was urgent, confused, almost desperate, something I had never heard before. I stood up slowly, smoothing my blouse, and walked toward his office. The door clicked shut behind me as I entered, and Richard was already seated, his expression a mixture of surprise and tension. He didn't waste any time. "You're leaving?" he asked, his voice disbelieving. I nodded, my gaze steady. "Yes, effective immediately." Richard stared at me for a long moment, processing the words as if trying to figure out if this was some sort of joke. "But why?" he asked, his voice still incredulous. "This is so sudden. We didn't discuss this." I couldn't help but laugh softly. "We didn't discuss Lisa's promotion either," I said, my voice a little sharper than I intended. His smile faltered, and I saw a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "Kathy, that wasn't personal. She just outperformed you. She's been here for 3 months, and you've been here for 5 years. I don't know what you expected." The words stung, but I kept my expression neutral. "If that's what you believe," I said, tilting my head slightly. Richard leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. "You know I appreciate you, Kathy. You've been a key part of this company. We don't want to lose you." I stared at him, the irony of his words almost unbearable. "You don't want to lose me?" I repeated, my voice calm but biting. But you had no problem overlooking me for a promotion I've earned. You had no problem humiliating me in front of the entire team. You had no problem telling me to take notes from someone with only 3 months of experience. The silence between us thickened, and I could see the cracks beginning to show in his usual smug demeanor. "Look, maybe I made a mistake," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe I mishandled the situation, but this... resigning out of nowhere? This isn't the right move, Kathy. You're making an emotional decision." I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "I sent that email on Friday night, Richard. If this was just emotion, I would have stormed out that very evening. But I didn't. I planned this, and I'm leaving on my terms." He sat back in his chair, his face hardening. "So what's your plan?" he asked, his voice sharp now. "Go to one of our competitors? I should remind you, Kathy, that we have non-compete agreements." I laughed again, the sound rich with irony. "Oh, Richard, you have no idea." I stood up, taking a moment to savor the moment before speaking again. "I don't need to go to a competitor. While you were busy ignoring my contributions, someone else wasn't." Richard frowned, confusion clouding his face. "What do you mean?" I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Do you remember Andrew Carter, the CFO you let go last year?" Richard's face immediately hardened at the mention of Andrew's name. He clearly remembered Andrew, one of the company's most valuable executives, who had clashed with Richard on more than one occasion before Richard had forced him out, thinking he was replaceable. I smiled, watching Richard's discomfort grow. "Andrew reached out to me a few months ago," I continued. "He's starting his own firm, and he wanted me to lead the operations department, a director-level position. I turned him down at first because I was loyal to this company. But after Friday night, after everything that happened, I called him right after I left the party, and he made the offer again, and this time, I accepted." Richard stared at me, his face unreadable. After a long moment, he spoke. "You're leaving for Andrew's company?" he asked, his voice tight. "I start next Monday," I confirmed, watching as the realization hit him like a freight train. The first few days after I made my decision were filled with a strange sense of calm, something I had not felt in years. The weight that had been hanging over me for so long was gone. I had finally made the choice to leave the company, to leave Richard, and most importantly, to leave behind the person I had become in the process. When I stepped into my new office at Carter & Associates, it felt as if I were walking into a completely different world. The walls, though they were still bare and the furniture sparse, felt open, as though they were waiting to be filled with the energy that I had so often given in the past. Only now it would be for something that was mine, something I had earned on my own terms. I looked out the window at the sprawling city below, the skyline gleaming with ambition, and for the first time in a long while, I could breathe deeply, feeling the weight of my own decisions settle comfortably within me. There was no longer a feeling of being trapped or invisible. There was only space to grow. The change in environment was almost symbolic. The glass walls, the clear view of the city outside, and the open space around me all conveyed a sense of transparency, freedom, and potential. It felt like stepping into a place that didn't just promise a future. It demanded my input, my ideas, my experience. Everything here was new, and yet it felt more like home than the company I had spent 5 years in ever had. As I began to settle into the rhythm of my new role, it became clearer and clearer just how much I had been taken for granted. At Richard's company, I had been the one who fixed problems, the one who handled the chaos, the one who everyone went to when things were falling apart. But here, there was none of that. People here didn't expect me to be a fixer. They didn't take me for granted. They recognized what I brought to the table. Every meeting, every conversation was different. There was no pretending to be busy, no subtext, no passive-aggressive comments veiled behind the guise of corporate pleasantries. People listened. People respected what I had to offer. I was no longer fighting for recognition. I was being heard. It was surreal, in a way, to be acknowledged so easily for what I had always done, but now I wasn't the one pushing for attention. It came to me naturally, without force. The day after I settled into my office, Andrew invited me to a leadership meeting. It was an opportunity for him to introduce me to the rest of the team and give me a chance to showcase my vision for the operations department. I hadn't expected to be put in the spotlight so soon, but it was a welcome challenge. The moment I walked into the room, I was greeted with smiles, nods, and genuine handshakes, as though they were already familiar with my work before I even spoke. There was no questioning my experience, no measuring up to others. There was a mutual respect that I hadn't experienced in years. Andrew was in the front of the room, and he turned to me with a nod, a gesture that made me feel seen in a way that felt both powerful and humbling. "Kathy," he said, smiling, "I want you to take the lead on our new initiative. We're restructuring the operations department, and with your experience, you're the perfect person for it." It was as if everything I had worked for, every sacrifice I had made, every extra hour spent doing the work that no one else wanted to touch, was now coming full circle. There was no need for me to prove myself. My value had already been established. I wasn't just another cog in the machine. I was integral to the company's future, and everyone in that room knew it. As the meeting progressed, I could feel the weight of my former role in Richard's company slipping further and further away. The meetings there had always been a dance of subtle manipulations and backhanded compliments, a tug of war over who could claim the spotlight. Here, it was different. Ideas were shared openly, feedback was given with respect, and collaboration wasn't a token gesture. It was the cornerstone of everything. I had been so accustomed to Richard's games, to the politics that ran under the surface of every conversation. I had learned to walk on eggshells, to temper my words, to fight for recognition. Here, I was allowed to simply be myself. That night, as I sat back in my new office, looking out over the city that now felt like my future, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The world I had left behind, the world of Richard's company, seemed far away. It was like an old dream that no longer made sense, something that had once defined me but now felt like a distant echo. I thought of the resignation email I had sent, the weight of the decision that had once seemed so heavy, now feeling almost trivial in hindsight. My former colleagues, those who had worked alongside me for years, had never realized the weight I had been carrying. They had never understood the toll that being overlooked, being undervalued, had taken on me. I thought of Lisa, the one who had been promoted in my place, the one who had barely been with the company long enough to know where the coffee machine was. She was a nice person, no doubt, but she wasn't the one who had spent 5 years of her life sacrificing for the company's success. It wasn't her fault, not really. She was just the lucky one who had been in the right place at the right time. And still, I couldn't help but feel a pang of resentment. The promotion that had been promised to me for so long, the recognition I had worked so hard for, had been handed to someone else. But at that moment, I realized something important. Lisa was no longer my concern. I had moved on, and there was no sense in holding on to the past. She was now just a footnote in my journey, and I had far more important things to focus on. The days that followed felt like a steady climb. The work was demanding but rewarding. My days were filled with meetings, brainstorming sessions, and strategizing for the future of the operations department. Every conversation I had with Andrew was a learning experience, a chance to understand the bigger picture of what he was trying to build. And yet, even as I was fully immersed in my new role, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfolding back at Richard's company. The whispers started trickling in a few days after my departure. At first, it was just vague mentions of disorganization and chaos, nothing that seemed all that unusual. But then, Rachel reached out to me, and the tone in her message was one of quiet shock. "Kathy," she began, "you won't believe what's happening. Richard's losing it. He can't handle the workload without you. Lisa's drowning. Everyone's trying to pick up the pieces, but no one knows how to do what you did. The clients are starting to notice, too." A small, satisfied smile played at my lips. I wasn't surprised. I had always been the one holding things together, even when no one saw it. I was the one who had been running the show behind the scenes, making sure things didn't fall apart. Now that I was gone, it was like a dam had broken and the cracks were starting to show. Rachel's updates became more frequent. "3 clients have already called asking for you by name," she said one afternoon. "They're not happy with the way things are going. They want you back." The irony was not lost on me. Richard had spent years taking me for granted, never seeing what I brought to the table, and now he was watching as the very clients he had relied on for so long began to turn to me. I wasn't actively trying to take clients away from him. They had simply realized that I was the one they trusted. I was the one who had built those relationships, not Richard. As the days passed, I found myself not just excelling at my new job, but relishing in the sweet satisfaction of watching Richard's company unravel. I had always been the steady hand, the one who kept everything moving smoothly, and now, without me, the entire operation was beginning to show its cracks. It wasn't that I wanted to see Richard fail. No, it wasn't about revenge. It was simply the result of his own actions. He had made the mistake of thinking I was disposable, and now he was reaping the consequences. I would have stayed if he had recognized my worth, if he had treated me with the respect I deserved. But he hadn't, and now I was thriving somewhere else. The real test came a week later when I received an email from Richard. It was a simple, short message asking for a meeting. I had to admit I was curious. Richard had been quiet for the past few days, probably trying to salvage what was left of his company. And now, here he was, reaching out. I knew what it meant. He was desperate. He was hoping I would come back, hoping I would fix everything he had broken. And for the first time in years, I realized that I was the one in control. I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction as I walked into my new office at Carter & Associates that Monday morning. The building was sleek and modern, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city below. There was something about this space that felt so different from the stifling confines of my old company. It wasn't just the decor or the spaciousness, though those factors played a role. What truly struck me was the air of ambition and energy that seemed to pulse through every corner of the office. There was an electricity here, a sense that everyone was working towards something bigger, something more meaningful. It wasn't about maintaining the status quo or simply collecting paychecks. It was about creating, building, and making a real impact. As I settled into my new role, I realized this wasn't just a job. It was a fresh start. A new chapter in my professional life, one where I was no longer an afterthought, no longer a cog in the machine that I'd once been at my old company. Here, I was valued for my expertise, my leadership, and my vision, and it felt incredible. The contrast between my first few days at Carter & Associates and the last few months at my previous job was jarring. At my old company, I'd often found myself questioning my worth, doubting the contributions I was making. I had spent 5 years pouring my energy into projects that often went unrecognized, enduring meetings where my ideas were brushed aside, and always being told to wait for my turn while watching others, less experienced, less committed, climb the ladder ahead of me. But here, at Carter, there was none of that. The very first leadership meeting I attended was a revelation. Andrew, the CEO, who had hired me just a few days prior, turned to me with a confident smile and said, "Kathy, I want you to take the lead on our new initiative. We're restructuring operations, and with your experience, you're the best person for it." There were no strings attached, no questions about my abilities, no need to prove myself over and over again. It was just a simple, straightforward acknowledgement of my skills. That was something I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't about begging for recognition or constantly having to justify my value. I was trusted from day one. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I belonged. It didn't take long for the impact of my departure from Richard's company to be felt. Within just a few days, the whispers started, quiet at first but growing louder as the week went on. It was as if the floor beneath Richard was slowly crumbling. I received a message from Rachel, one of the few people who had supported me during my time there, telling me how Richard was losing his grip on the company. She had heard that he had called an emergency meeting to try and manage the fallout from my resignation, but it was too late. Clients were already reaching out, asking for me by name, expressing their dissatisfaction with the state of affairs at my old company. It was clear that I hadn't been the only one who had noticed the cracks in the foundation. Richard had spent so long taking me for granted, assuming I would always be there, always be loyal. But now he was finding out that people don't stay in places where they're undervalued. They leave. And when they leave, they often take the people who trusted them with them. The clients who had once relied on me, who had trusted me to handle their needs with care and expertise, were now turning their backs on Richard's company, and it was all happening without any effort from me. I didn't have to steal clients away or actively try to sabotage the business. The damage had been done, and it was Richard's mismanagement that had caused it. The following days were a whirlwind of activity and exhilaration. I was settling into my role at Carter & Associates, where every project I touched seemed to come to life with new energy. My team respected me, my ideas were embraced, and the company's leadership was genuinely interested in my contributions. It was a stark contrast to the environment I had left behind. Richard's company, on the other hand, was sinking fast. Rachel kept me updated, sending messages about how Lisa was drowning in the responsibilities she had inherited. Richard had thrown her into a role she wasn't ready for, and it was already clear she couldn't handle the pressure. She was floundering, and the once proud company was beginning to feel the weight of its poor decisions. Lisa's promotion, which had felt so humiliating to me at the time, was now proving to be a disaster. Clients were leaving in droves, and the leadership team was scrambling to keep everything from falling apart. I could practically hear Richard's frustration through the phone as Rachel described his increasingly frantic attempts to fix the damage. But even as Richard's empire began to crumble, I wasn't looking back. I had made my choice, and I was thriving. My new role at Carter had quickly become everything I had hoped for and more. The challenges were different here, more inspiring, more meaningful, and every day felt like an opportunity to grow. Meanwhile, Richard's company was starting to hemorrhage clients. I hadn't even had to lift a finger, and yet the consequences of his actions were playing out in real time. It was almost surreal to watch it unfold from the sidelines. The whispers among my former colleagues continued to circulate, and I could almost feel their judgment as they watched Richard scramble to recover. Some of them, especially Rachel, reached out to me regularly with updates about how Richard was losing control of the situation. One by one, clients were pulling out of long-standing contracts, and the company's reputation was starting to fray at the edges. Even Lisa, who had once seemed so untouchable in her promotion, was now facing the fallout of being placed in a position she wasn't equipped to handle. And then came the email from Richard. It was a message that felt inevitable, and yet it still made me laugh. His desperation was evident in every word. The subject line read, "A proposal." And as I opened the email, it became clear that he was finally offering me everything I had been denied for so long. He wanted me back in his company, back in the position I had earned, and this time he was prepared to offer me a substantial raise, a senior executive title, and full decision-making authority over my department. It was as if he had suddenly woken up to the reality of my value, only it was too late. The email was a perfect reflection of how far he had fallen. It was a desperate attempt to salvage what little remained of the company I had once helped build, and the irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years waiting for Richard to see my worth, only to have him offer it to me when he had no other options left. There was no longer any illusion of fairness or respect. It was simply a last-ditch effort to prevent further destruction. I couldn't help but laugh when I saw Richard's email. It was so typical of him to only recognize my value now that everything was crumbling around him. I had spent 5 years trying to prove myself, only to be overlooked time and time again. And now, when the company was on the brink of disaster, he was offering me everything I had deserved all along. But it was too little, too late. I wasn't going to go back to a place where I had been taken for granted. I wasn't going to be someone's last resort, someone they only thought of when it was convenient for them. My decision had been made. I wasn't going back to that environment, no matter how much money or power was dangled in front of me. I had already found a place where I was valued, where my contributions mattered, and I wasn't about to throw that away. The next day, Richard called me. I could hear the strain in his voice, the desperation behind his words. He wanted me to come back, to fix what he had broken, but I wasn't interested. I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to be a pawn in his game anymore. I wasn't going to let him think he could undo the damage he had caused just by offering me a bigger paycheck. He had underestimated me, and now he was paying the price. I listened to his pleas, but I didn't let them sway me. I stood my ground, and in the end, it was clear that he had no real understanding of what I had brought to the table. I wasn't interested in being the savior of a company that had never truly respected me. I was done. The final blow to Richard came a few weeks later when Rachel sent me a message that made me laugh out loud. "Richard just got fired," she said. The board had finally had enough. The company couldn't recover from the losses, the client departures, and the chaos Richard had caused. It was a fitting end for a man who had failed to recognize the value of those around him. As I sat back in my chair, savoring the news, I realized that in the end, it wasn't about the promotion or the recognition. It was about finding my worth, standing up for myself, and making the choice to leave a place that didn't value me. And in the end, it was Richard who had been replaceable, not me. At Carter & Associates, I was thriving. The company was flourishing, our client roster growing, and the future was full of possibilities. I had found my place, a place where I could be myself, where my skills were valued, and where I could make a real difference. Richard had thought I was disposable, but I had shown him that no one is truly irreplaceable. And as I watched the company I had once been a part of crumble, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Sometimes the best way to make your point is to simply walk away. And when I did, I found that the world opened up in ways I had never imagined. I was finally free,